Chapter 6, Part 2 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Removal to Brunswick, 1850 through 1852, Part 2. The year 1850 is one memorable in the history of our nation, as well as in the quiet household that we have followed in its pilgrimage from Cincinnati to Brunswick. The signers of the Declaration of Independence and the statesmen and soldiers of the Revolution were no friends of Negro slavery. In fact, the very principles of the Declaration of Independence sounded the death knell of slavery forever. No stronger utterances against this national sin are to be found anywhere than in the letters and published writings of Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, and Patrick Henry. Jefferson encountered difficulties greater than he could overcome, and after vain wrestlings the words that broke from him, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever," were words of despair. From Bancroft's funeral oration on Lincoln, "It was the desire of Washington's heart that Virginia should remove slavery by a public act, and as the prospects of a general emancipation grew more and more dim, he did all that he could by bequeathing freedom to his own slaves." Hamilton was one of the founders of the Manumission Society, the object of which was the abolition of slaves in the state of New York. Patrick Henry, speaking of slavery, said, "A serious view of this subject gives a gloomy prospect to future times." Slavery was thought by the founders of our republic to be a dying institution, and all the provisions of the Constitution touching slavery looked toward gradual emancipation as an inevitable result of the growth of the democracy. From an economic standpoint, slave labor had ceased to be profitable. "The whole interior of the Southern States was languishing, and its inhabitants emigrating for want of some object to engage their attention and employ their industry." The cultivation of cotton was not profitable for the reason that there was no machine for separating the seed from the fiber. This was the state of affairs in 1793, when Eli Whitney, a New England mechanic, at this time residing in Savannah, Georgia, invented his cotton gin, or a machine to separate seed and fiber. "The invention of this machine at once set the whole country into active motion. The effect of this invention may to some extent be appreciated when we consider that whereas in 1793 the Southern States produced only about 5,000 or 10,000 bales, and in 1859 they produced over 5 millions. But with this increase of the cotton culture the value of slave property was augmented. Slavery grew and spread. In 1818 to 1821 it first became a factor in politics during the Missouri Compromise. By this compromise slavery was not to extend north of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. From the time of this compromise till the year 1833 the slavery agitation slumbered. This was the year that the British set the slaves free in their West Indian dependencies. This act caused great uneasiness among the slaveholders of the South. The National Anti-Slavery Society met in Philadelphia and pronounced slavery a national sin, which could be atoned for only by immediate emancipation. Such men as Garrison and Lundy began a work of agitation that was soon to set the whole nation in a ferment. From this time on slavery became the central problem of American history and the line of cleavage in American politics. The invasion of Florida, when it was yet the territory of a nation at peace with the United States, and its subsequent purchase from Spain, the annexation of Texas, and the war with Mexico were the direct results of the policy of the pro-slavery party to increase its influence and its territory. In 1849, the state of California knocked at the door of the Union for admission as a free state. This was bitterly opposed by the slaveholders of the South, who saw in it a menace to the slave power from the fact that no slave state was seeking admission at the same time. Both North and South the feeling ran so high as to threaten the dismemberment of the Union, and the scenes of violence and bloodshed which were to come 11 years afterwards. It was to preserve the Union and avert the danger of the hour that Henry Clay brought forward his celebrated compromise measures in the winter of 1850. To conciliate the North, California was to be admitted as a free state. To pacify the slaveholders of the South, more stringent laws were to be enacted concerning persons bound to service in one state and escaping into another. By 7th of March, 1850, Daniel Webster made his celebrated speech in which he defended this compromise, and the abolitionists of the North were filled with indignation, which found its most fitting expression in Whittier's Ichabod, "So fallen, so lost, the glory from his gray hairs gone. When honor dies, the man is dead." It was in the midst of this excitement that Mrs. Stowe, with her children and her modest hopes for the future, arrived at the house of her brother, Dr. Edward Beecher. Dr. Beecher had been the intimate friend and supporter of Lovejoy, who had been murdered by the slaveholders at Alton for publishing an anti-slavery paper. His soul was stirred to its very depth by the iniquitous law which was at this time being debated in Congress, a law which not only gave the slaveholder of the South the right to seek out and bring back into slavery any colored person whom he claimed as a slave, but commanded the people of the free states to assist in this revolting business. The most frequent theme of conversation while Mrs. Stowe was in Boston was this proposed law, and when she arrived in Brunswick her soul was all on fire with indignation at this new indignity and wrong about to be inflicted by the slave power on the innocent and defenseless. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, letter after letter was received by Mrs. Stowe in Brunswick from Mrs. Edward Beecher and other friends, describing the heart-rending scenes which were the inevitable results of the enforcement of this terrible law. Cities were more available for the capturing of escaped slaves than the country, and Boston, which claimed to have the cradle of liberty, opened her doors to the slave hunters. The sorrow and anguish caused thereby no pen could describe. Families were broken up. Some hid in garrets and cellars. Some fled to the wharves and embarked in ships and sailed for Europe. Others went to Canada. One poor fellow who was doing good business as a crockery merchant and supporting his family well, when he got notice that his master, whom he had left many years before, was after him, set out for Canada in midwinter on foot, as he did not dare to take a public conveyance. He froze both of his feet on the journey, and they had to be amputated. Mrs. Edward Beecher, in a letter to Mrs. Stowe's son, writing of this period, says, "I had been nourishing an anti-slavery spirit since Lovejoy was murdered for publishing his paper articles against slavery and intemperance, when our home was in Illinois. These terrible things which were going on in Boston were well calculated to rouse up this spirit. What can I do? I thought. Not much myself, but I know one who can. So I wrote several letters to your mother, telling her of various heart-rending events caused by the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. I remember distinctly saying in one of them, "Now, Hattie, if I could use a pen as you can, I would write something that would make this whole nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is." When we lived in Boston, your mother often visited us. Several numbers of Uncle Tom's Cabin were written in your Uncle Edward's study at these times, and read to us from the manuscripts. A member of Mrs. Stowe's family well remembers the scene in the little parlor in Brunswick when the letter alluded to was received. Mrs. Stowe herself read it aloud to the assembled family, and when she came to the passage, "I would write something that would make this whole nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is," Mrs. Stowe rose up from her chair, crushing the letter in her hand, and with an expression on her face that stamped itself on the mind of her child, said, "I will write something. I will if I live." This was the origin of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Professor Cairns has well said in his admirable work, The Slave Power, "The fugitive slave law has been to the slave power a questionable gain. Among its first fruits was Uncle Tom's Cabin." The purpose of writing a story that should make the whole nation feel that slavery was an accursed thing was not immediately carried out. In December, 1850, Mrs. Stowe writes, Tell Sister Katie I thank her for her letter and will answer it. As long as the baby sleeps with me nights, I can't do much at anything, but I will do it at last. I will write that thing if I live. What are folks in general saying about the slave law and the stand taken by Boston ministers universally, except Edward? To me it is incredible, amazing, mournful. I feel as if I should be willing to sink with it, were all the sin and misery to sink in the sea. I wish father would come on to Boston and preach on the fugitive slave law, as once he preached on the slave trade when I was a little girl in Litchfield. I sobbed aloud in one pew, and Mrs. Judge Reeves in another. I wish some Martin Luther would arise to set this community right." December 22nd, 1850, she writes to her husband in Cincinnati, "Christmas has passed, not without many thoughts of our absent one. If you want a description of the scenes in our family preceding it, read A New Year's Story, which I have sent to the New York Evangelist. I am sorry that in the hurry of getting off this piece and one for the Era you were neglected. The piece for the Era was a humorous article called A Scholar's Adventures in the Country, being, in fact, a picture drawn from life and embodying Professor Stowe's efforts in the Department of Agriculture while in Cincinnati." December 29th, 1850. "We have had terrible weather here. I remember such a storm when I was a child in Litchfield. Father and mother went to Warren and were almost lost in the snowdrifts. Sunday night I rather watched than slept. The wind howled, and the house rocked just as our old Litchfield house used to. The cold has been so intense that the children have kept begging to get up from table at meal times to warm feet and fingers. Our airtight stoves warm all but the floor. Heat your heads and keep your feet freezing. If I sit by the open fire in the parlor, my back freezes. If I sit in my bedroom and try to write, my head aches and my feet are cold. I am projecting a sketch for the Era on the capabilities of liberated blacks to take care of themselves. Can't you find out for me how much Willie Watson has paid for the redemption of his friends, and get any items in figures of that kind you can pick up in Cincinnati? When I have a headache and feel sick, as I do today, there is actually not a place in the house where I can lie down and take a nap without being disturbed. Overhead is the schoolroom, next door is the dining room, and the girls practice there 2 hours a day. If I lock my door and lie down, someone is sure to be rattling the latch before 15 minutes have passed. There is no doubt in my mind that our expenses this year will come to $200, if not $3, beyond our salary. We shall be able to come through, notwithstanding, but I don't want to feel obliged to work as hard every year as I have this. I can earn $400 a year by writing, but I don't want to feel that I must, and when weary with teaching the children, and tending the baby, and buying provisions, and mending dresses, and darning socks, sit down and write a piece for some paper." January 12, 1851, Mrs. Stowe again writes to Professor Stowe in Cincinnati, "Ever since we left Cincinnati to come here, the good hand of God has been visibly guiding our way. Through what difficulties have we been brought! Though we knew not where means were coming from, yet means have been furnished every step of the way, and in every time of need. I was just in some discouragement with regard to my writing, thinking that the editor of the Era was overstocked with contributors, and would not want my services another year, and lo, he sends me $100, and ever so many good words with it. Our income this year will be $1,700 in all, and I hope to bring our expenses within $1,300." It was in the month of February, after these words were written, that Mrs. Stowe was seated at communion service in the college church at Brunswick. Suddenly, like the unrolling of a picture, the scene of the death of Uncle Tom passed before her mind. So strongly was she affected that it was with difficulty she could keep from weeping aloud. Immediately on returning home, she took pen and paper and wrote out the vision which had been as it were blown into her mind, as by the rushing of a mighty wind. Gathering her family about her, she read what she had written. Her 2 little ones of 10 and 12 years of age broke into convulsions of weeping, one of them saying through his sobs, "Oh, mamma, slavery is the most cruel thing in the world." Thus Uncle Tom was ushered into the world, as it was, as we said at the beginning, a cry, an immediate and involuntary expression of deep, impassioned feeling. 25 years afterwards, Mrs. Stowe wrote in a letter to one of her children of this period of her life, "I well remember the winter you were a baby, and I was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. My heart was bursting with the anguish excited by the cruelty and injustice our nation was showing to the slave, and praying God to let me do a little, and to cause my cry for them to be heard. I remember many a night weeping over you as you lay sleeping beside me, and I thought of the slave mothers whose babes were torn from them." It was not till the following April that the first chapter of the story was finished and sent on to the National Era at Washington. In July, Mrs. Stowe wrote to Frederick Douglass the following letter, which is given entire as the best possible introduction to the history of the career of that memorable work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Brunswick, July 9, 1851. Frederick Douglass, Esquire. Sir, you may perhaps have noticed in your editorial readings a series of articles that I am furnishing for the Era under the title of Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. In the course of my story, the scene will fall upon a cotton plantation. I am very desirous, therefore, to gain information from one who has been an actual laborer on one, and it occurred to me that in the circle of your acquaintance there might be one who would be able to communicate with me some such information as I desire. I have before me an able paper written by a Southern planter, in which the details and modus operandi are given from his point of sight. I am anxious to have something more from another standpoint. I wish to be able to make a picture that shall be graphic and true to nature in its details. Such a person as Henry Bibb, if in the country, might give me just the kind of information I desire. You may possibly know of some other person. I will subjoin to this letter a list of questions, which in that case you will do me a favor by enclosing to the individual, with the request that he will at earliest convenience answer them. For some few weeks past I have received your paper through the mail, and have read it with great interest, and desire to return my acknowledgments for it. It will be a pleasure to me at some time, when less occupied, to contribute something to its columns. I have noticed with regret your sentiments on two subjects, the Church and African colonization, with the more regret because I think you have a considerable share of reason for your feelings on both these subjects, but I would willingly, if I could, modify your views on both points. In the first place, you say the Church is pro-slavery. There is a sense in which this may be true. The American Church, of all denominations, taken as a body, comprises the best and most conscientious people in the country. I do not say it comprises none but these, or that none such are found out of it, but only if a census were taken of the purest and most highly principled men and women of the country, the majority of them would be found to be professors of religion in some of the various Christian denominations. This fact has given to the Church great weight in this country. The general and predominant spirit of intelligence and probity and piety of its majority has given it that degree of weight that it has the power to decide the great moral questions of the day. Whatever it unitedly and decidedly sets itself against as moral evil, it can put down. In this sense, the Church is responsible for the sin of slavery. Dr. Barnes has beautifully and briefly expressed this on the last page of his work on slavery, when it says, "Not all the force out of the Church could sustain slavery an hour if it were not sustained in it." It then appears that the Church has the power to put an end to this evil, and does not do it. In this sense she may be said to be pro-slavery. But the Church has the same power over intemperance and Sabbath-breaking and sin of all kinds. There is not a doubt that if the moral power of the Church were brought up to the New Testament standpoint, it is sufficient to put an end to all these as well as to slavery. But I would ask you, Would you consider it a fair representation of the Christian Church in this country to say that it is pro-intemperance, pro-Sabbath breaking, and pro-everything that it might put down if it were in a higher state of moral feeling? If you should make a list of all the abolitionists of the country, I think that you would find a majority of them in the church. Certainly some of the most influential and efficient ones are ministers. I am a minister's daughter and a minister's wife, and I have had 6 brothers in the ministry. One is in heaven. I certainly ought to know something of the feelings of ministers on this subject. I was a child in 1820 when the Missouri question was agitated, and one of the strongest and deepest impressions on my mind was that made by my father's sermons and prayers, and the anguish of his soul for the poor slave at that time. I remember his preaching drawing tears down the hardest faces of the old farmers in his congregation. I well remember his prayers morning and evening in the family for poor, oppressed, bleeding Africa, that the time of her deliverance might come, prayers offered with strong crying and tears, and which indelibly impressed my heart and made me what I am from my very soul, the enemy of all slavery. Every brother I have has been in his sphere a leading anti-slavery man. One of them was to the last the bosom friend and counselor of Lovejoy. As for myself and husband, we have for the last 17 years lived on the border of a slave state, and we have never shrunk from the fugitives, and we have helped them with all we had to give. I have received the children of liberated slaves into a family school, and taught them with my own children, and it has been the influence that we found in the church and by the altar that has made us do all this. Gather up all the sermons that have been published on this offensive and unchristian fugitive slave law, and you will find that those against it are numerically more than those in its favor, and yet some of the strongest opponents have not published their sermons. Out of 13 ministers who met with my husband weekly for discussion of moral subjects, only 3 are found who will acknowledge or obey this law in any shape. After all, my brother, the strength and hope of your oppressed race does lie in the church, in hearts united to him of whom it is said, quote, "He shall spare the souls of the needy, and precious shall their blood be in his sight." End quote. Everything is against you, but Jesus Christ is for you, and he has not forgotten his church, misguided and erring though it be. I have looked all the field over with despairing eyes. I see no hope but in him. This movement must and will become a purely religious one. The light will spread in churches. The tone of feeling will rise. Christians north and south will give up all connection with and take up their testimony against slavery, and thus the work will be done. End quote. This letter gives us a conception of the state of moral and religious exaltation of the heart and mind out of which flowed chapter after chapter of that wonderful story. It all goes to prove the correctness of the position from which we started, that Uncle Tom's Cabin came from the heart rather than the head. It was an outburst of deep feeling, a cry in the darkness. The writer no more thought of style or literary excellence than the mother who rushes into the street and cries for help to save her children from a burning house thinks of the teachings of the rhetorician or the elocutionist. A few years afterwards, Mrs. Stowe, writing of this story, said, quote, "This story is to show how Jesus Christ, who liveth and was dead, and now is alive and forevermore, has still a mother's love for the poor and lowly, and that no man can sink so low but that Jesus Christ will stoop to take his hand. Who so low, who so poor, who so despised as the American slave? The law almost denies his existence as a person, and regards him for the most part as less than a man, a mere thing, the property of another. The law forbids him to read or write, to hold property, to make a contract, or even to form a legal marriage. It takes from him all legal right to a wife of his bosom, the children of his body. He can do nothing, possess nothing, acquire nothing but what must belong to his master. Yet even to this slave Jesus Christ stoops from where he sits at the right hand of the Father, and says, Fear not, thou whom man despiseth, for I am thy brother. Fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name. Thou art mine. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a work of religion, the fundamental principle of the gospel applied to the burning question of Negro slavery. It sets forth those principles of the Declaration of Independence that made Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, and Patrick Henry anti-slavery men, not in the language of the philosopher, but in a series of pictures. Mrs. Stowe spoke to the understanding and moral sense through the imagination. Uncle Tom's Cabin made the enforcement of the fugitive slave law an impossibility. It aroused the public sentiment of the world by presenting in the concrete that which had been a mere series of abstract propositions. It was, as we have already said, an appeal to the imagination through a series of pictures. People are like children, and understand pictures better than words. Someone rushes into your dining room while you are at breakfast and cries out, Terrible railroad accident, 40 killed and wounded, 6 were burned alive. Oh, shocking, dreadful, you exclaim, and yet go quietly on with your rolls and coffee. But suppose you stood at that instant by the wreck and saw the mangled dead and heard the piercing shrieks of the wounded, you would be faint and dizzy with the intolerable spectacle. So Uncle Tom's Cabin made the crack of the slaveholder's whip and the cries of the tortured blacks ring in every household in the land, till human hearts could endure it no longer. End of chapter 6. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.